In general, companies, um, you know, perform as per the business cycle. However, a number of firms have made significant investments in outsourcing that have gone awry, fell off track and are now in serious problems. My name is Garfield Heron. The name of my presentation is Long-Term Failures of Firms That Outsource. Reasons contributing to failure of firms that outsource excessively and mitigation options. This is for Professor Gu. The class is ISM 6509. We have heard of the failures of companies such as Dell and HP. These companies have taken the concept of offshoring and committed a large portion of strategy and resources in a wholesale push to drive profits. Where are these companies now? Let's take HP. The hardware portion of the business is being spun off in an attempt to cauterize the damage. This is pretty much like a dying patient removing essential organs in an attempt to save herself. Unlike EDS, which is now flourishing, which, by the way, was the outsourcing firm contracted by HP. Similarly, Dell Computers. Michael Dell, in an attempt to rescue the company he started, has now taken the company private. So what went wrong? This presentation will review some of the issues that may have contributed to the long-term decline of these companies. Michael Dell himself said, if you don't accept risk, you don't get any innovation. And that means part of the risk is you have to accept failure because not everything works. Looking on the charts to the right here, we see days in inventory. Companies such as Dell and HP were trying to run very lean, had a very low number in inventory turns. But we don't want that number too low, right? A sustained low number is not necessarily good. This illustrates some of the failures and why Dell himself has brought the company back private in an attempt to rescue it. How would you feel if you went to the mall to get a suit, a tailored suit, and there were 4 stores there? You went into the first store and the store clerk gave you a quote of $200. You went to the second store and you got a quote of $25. That's a quarter of what the first store is offering you. You wouldn't even continue to the other stores. You would then say, okay, and you would go ahead. No, what if you came back a week later to the other store, the same one that charged you $25, and no, they've said to you, well, due to some delay, it's now going to cost you $75, and you're going to come back you need to come back 3 weeks later. 3 weeks later, you now return to that store, and this you have additional charges. How would you feel? That's pretty much the experience of 50% of all companies that have gone down the outsourcing path. Constant delays, run up in charges, quotes and expectations, and final billing are misaligned. Company executives view offshoring as the panacea for all their to cure all their ills. This have led them down a path where they've actually missed opportunities to improve performance. In instances such as this, the Harvard Business Review has looked on these items and categorized them as missed opportunities. In that same Harvard Business Review, title of it is offshore, are you offshoring your problems? It pointed out to areas where the company should, rather than offshoring, look within themselves and reorganize their processes. 90% of the time, there are wins in there, just by investigating the processes. Then you have to look at on scale and economy, and you have to find the sweet spot. How much do you scale? How much do you commit? And how much do you take the economy option? All of these opportunities are generally not looked upon. Firms often look to outsourcing as a panacea for operational headaches. Some of these failures that occur are due to the following operational issues. Buyer unclear expectations upfront, poor governance, poor communication, poor cultural fit, and we'll look at this further on in the presentation. Interest become misaligned over time. No win-win mutual benefits. Providers poor performance. Buyers multi-supplier environment. These can all be categorized as operational challenges, whether it be offshore or whether it be internal. Companies use offshore inappropriately to address these deep problems. Companies, in trying to improve performance, misapply offshoring strategies. So how do you mitigate and handle lost opportunities? In the Harvard Business Review, outsourcing your operational issues. It makes mention of the following. Prior to offshoring your problems, you should look for opportunities and ways to improve your processes. Because if your processes are bad, by offshoring these problems, they're not going to go away. How do you so how do you address this? Let's look on the operational challenges mentioned in the slide previous to this. You need to be clear on your expectations internally upfront. There has to be governance over your internal processes. You must have clear lines of communication. And in choosing vendors, there must be some amount of understanding of the culture. If there's no mutual beneficial win-win scenario for the vendor or the employee and the company, there can be no success. All of these issues have to be addressed internally before a company even attempts to outsource, whether it be in-source, nearshore, or offshore. In the Harvard Business Review, Getting Offshoring Right makes mention of IP and picking the right processes. How do you manage the risk of losing IP or categorizing IP in such a way that you identify these processes that are crucial to the business? How do you address these issues? The article makes mention of ranking the process by value. So you ask yourself the following: how crucial are these processes to the business? And secondly, to what degree do these processes enable the operation of the business? And to the right there, you have diagram where you have a metric, some kind of matrix, that will allow a company to rank and address these issues. So, for example, float management of suppliers and dealers, value creation ranking, value capture ranking, and then you have some amount of total ranking, and the rest goes on. Distance. I want to dwell on this topic for the next few slides, as I believe this is a large contributing factor to the success or failure of a firm's efforts in integrating people across borders. No exploration of distance would be complete without mentioning this famous academic Hofstede. According to the book Global Environment of Business by David Conklin, he makes mention of Hofstede topology. In analyzing cultural differences, the book continues. Many academics base their research on the topology created by Hofstede that came out in 1991 and 2000. Gemawatt, which I will explore later on in the presentation, builds on top of this whole idea of distance, not only being geography. Hofstede had dimensionalized distance by not only geography, but broke it down into other categories like power distance, individualism, masculinity, femininity, some amount of uncertainty. If you look on the graph, the image here, you will notice countries like the US, it has an overall score of say 39 to 51, and compare that to countries such as China or India, where they have an index of greater than 75. Having this large disparity between this index is a clear indication that in managing these cross-border interaction at any level, these distances must be addressed. In the Harvard Business Review by Gemhardt, distance still matters. Gemhardt takes this concept of distance a little bit beyond what Hofstede has done. He comes up with a different set of index, replaces the multiple by another more refined framework. The framework generally called cage framework, where distance is measured by cultural differences, administrative differences, geographical differences, economical differences. And in dealing whether as a vendor to a supplier, either way, whether a US company is buying from a company overseas, or a US company is trying to penetrate a market overseas, or a US company is outsourcing work overseas. These distances must be addressed. The difference in the culture, the difference in administrative styles, the geographical challenges that comes, and the economic challenges, the differences in GDP. All of these differences must be addressed. As I said before, one of the major stumbling blocks operationally in handling offshoring is this whole cage distance that's not adequately addressed. You have cultural distance different languages, ethnicities, religions, social norms. So that's a large part of human interaction, right? You have to be able to manage these different cultural differences that are oftentimes, the majority of times, unstated in a contract. And there are some products that are very susceptible to these cultural differences. For example, the size of a car, standards, packaging, work. Female did something, then other cultures with a high male-female difference. Notice the build on Hofstede. Males generally do not want to perform those tasks. Those are those tacit cultural differences that need to be addressed. Then you have administrative distances. So here again you have Hofstede power distance indexes coming into play. Gemmawatt refines it a little bit to a more working relationship that he calls administrative distance. You know, there we have, for example, absence of colonial ties, political hostility, industries that are affected. You know, these include large employers, and he breaks them down to relevant areas that affect cross-border commerce. Clearly, geographical distance. These distances need to be mitigated. You have issues such as the size of a country, transportation, communication links. So if you're outsourcing to a country and the communication links are not up to your expectation, having certain amount of reliance on these communication links could be devastating. Then again, you have differences in consumer income, differences in natural resources, human resources. So all of these differences need to be addressed when you're dealing with, cross-border areas. Gemmawatt tries to put an index in there. He then refines it further, and he calls this new index his refined process is country portfolio analysis adjusted for distance. So normally you would think that Japan and the US were closer, but with some amount of refinement, you will find that, for example, Canada and the US are much closer. So, with these refinements, you can almost get an index as to which country you should be looking at when you're trying to move forward with cross-border commerce. So the question then becomes, how do you mitigate items that are highlighted by this cage framework, which builds upon Hofstede work of this, dimensional differences. So you're going to want to look on a couple of items when you're going to outsource and when, and how you're going to address it. There's certain things you want to consider. You want to consider differences in in the culture, right? You need to look on the respective stakeholders' values and norms and disposition. You, if that distance there is too large at any level, at all levels of interaction, and even indirect interaction, you're going to have issues. So relationships need to be built around this understanding of cultural difference. Then how do you then navigate administrative distances? You're going to have to tackle these and understand that a certain amount of tenacity has to be there with administrative differences, or the distance in the vendor you're choosing administratively needs to be, aligned, or accounted for at least along those administrative distance. So what we're saying here is, in the, you know Asian cultures where there's a large power distance versus the power distance here in the US, where everyone is on a first name basis, from the regular line worker to the CEO. Everyone is on a first name basis. It's not necessarily so in Asian countries where the power distance is large. How do you account for that? Because what you could have there is an instance where a line worker, calls up the CEO of, a vendor, and calls him by his first name, as, in a more familiar, and uses very familiar terms, the absence of, and their terms of endearment. I mean, that could cause a serious rift and has led to many failures. Then geographical distance. How do you account for geographical distance? You need to listen to your stakeholders, all stakeholders, and make sure you account for these various geographical distance. Clearly, economic distance, that's going to impact your infrastructure, your vendor or your supplier, or even your customers may have economic issues that affect organization capabilities and infrastructure. So these are items to consider when you're looking to mitigate all the, these points within the cage framework. So in conclusion, to tie all these points together, how do we account for this large failure rate in outsourcing? And a lot of these failures can be attributed to the operational opportunities that were not addressed. Relying on outsourcing to fix a problem that outsourcing wasn't designed to fix. I know of a company here in South Florida that, they're trying to mitigate issues with, items. They're a manufacturing company, and it's being threatened by cheaper items coming out of Asia. I said to the operational manager, have you looked on automation? I mean, you cannot compete with cheap labor elsewhere, and you need to look on automation. And his response was, well, until the company is not making any money from an inefficient process, there's no reason to look. But in another breath, he is indicating that he can't compete against cheap labor. So these are some of the real operational opportunities that need to be addressed. And companies don't generally do that. They usually get stuck in a rut, and they don't change at all, and they collapse. So they then move and say, hey, I'm going to move my operations to another country with cheaper labor. But your process is inefficient, and moving an inefficient process geographically is not going to address the issue, and has not addressed the issue. So how do you then move forward? Well, clearly there needs to be some amount of analysis, and basically not being satisfied with your process. Pick your low-hanging fruit, and address those operational items, because outsourcing does not address that. A lot of these things, companies look towards, they're I don't know, someone's at a cocktail party, and they hear outsourcing and they say, okay, that will fix my problem. No, you have to constantly analyze your processes, constantly moving towards a better process. And then when you do decide to outsource, you have to understand that distance is not only geographic. Distance has multiple dimensions, and all of these dimensions must be accounted for in all phases of choice, right? So from picking a suitable location to when you have when that location is chosen, to daily interactions, that these distances which have multiple dimensions, these must be accounted for. And when they're not accounted for, these leads to all of these unaccounted distances will lead to failure, and has led to failure.